If you're into guitar building, stick around. We're coming to the final stretch of the Great Guitar Build-Off Unofficial competition. We'll see if I can finish it in time. There's still a few critical issues to take care of, and some assembly is required. As always, I'll be going step by step, and with methods and tools you don't need to break the bank to have. So stay with me. Let's build a guitar. Hi, I'm Yoav and this is the Electric Luthier. Today, we'll continue in the 7th part of the guitar I'm building for the Great Guitar Build-Off. Today I'll give the last coat of True Oil and start with all the finishing touches to make all the separate parts into a guitar. I'll need to attach the neck to the body, install the nut and the tuners, attach the bridge and pickups, and let's not forget soldering some electronics and other bits and pieces. Before finishing, and the final layer of True Oil, I'll take this wonderful 12 to 1500 grit sandpaper pad and give a light scuffing to everything. The whitish powder you see is not because of the large quantity of the dust, but because of how fine it is. Sadly, it's hard to convey how smooth it feels, even with the gloves which I usually take off for sanding. I make sure I remove all that fine dust. A very light coat, which practically glides on both the body and the neck, is applied, and once more I leave it overnight. The next day it's dry with a beautiful sheen. Our first order of the day is the control cavity and cover. I've been wanting to do a screwless cover for a while. A well-fitted cover with magnets is what I'm going for. I have a whole bunch of these tiny little magnets which should fit just fine. They fit a 4mm drill, which is about 0.16 of an inch, but the real trick here, unless you have a drill press with a good depth limiter, is not to drill through the thin cover. Again, I turn to my old manual drill. It really gives better sensitivity to the depth. It's also just a whole lot slower, so you will have more time to stop. I'll first drill the cover, which I will fit with a single magnet for each position. I place them without gluing at first, so I can align them before the glue. The body side will be drilled deeper and will receive 2 magnets each. Doubling the number of magnets almost doubles the pull, and since I'm not going into physics of the magnets here, I'm just going to try to make sure they're strong enough to hold the cover. I finish drilling each hole and fit the 2 magnets while making sure they're pretty much flush with the surface. I then put a drop or 2 of super glue and let it wick in. After it's dry enough, I take each of the cover magnets and place it on the other 2. This way, I know the magnetic pole is aligned properly and it will be pulled and not pushed, which would counter the whole purpose of the magnets. I then take each one and carefully flip it into place. A dab of super glue for each one will secure it. I add a small hole to enable pulling the cover with any small screwdriver or Allen key. The strap hooks are next. There's no complicated method here. I find the midpoint for the thickness, drill a small pilot hole, and just screw it in. The second one will just be on the center line of the guitar body. While we're drilling, it's time to whip out the long drill. Mine is a 6mm, almost 1/4 inch, and is used for connecting cavities without routing channels. The first one is drilled from the neck pocket through the neck pickup cavity and into the bridge cavity. This will allow for the neck pickup wiring to get to the control cavity through the neck pickup cavity and the next one I'm going to drill now. I flip the body over. I think it'll be more comfortable and safe from this side. I want to drill diagonally from the back to the front, coming out at the wall of the cavity. I mark the direction to aim for on a piece of masking tape and add more masking tape to protect the back from the low angle at which I'm holding the drill. It's a little hard to see, but I came out exactly where planned. I can now get ready for connecting the neck and the body. I carefully measure and fit the right drill bit and depth for these 4 screws. With a good tight fit as I have, the clamp is really just for precaution, and I put it in a way which will leave area for the 2 front screws exposed. I double check the measurements, position and depth, and then drill the first 2 holes. After screwing the first one in, I remember that these places really benefit from a little wax for a good tight fit with a screw. The lowered friction will also protect the screw itself from breaking under the final tightening. It's also recommended to manually tighten the last few turns. You will have better feel for what's going on. I dip the second screw in some old kiwi beeswax and screw it in. The neck is not going anywhere now. I leave the screws and washer out just as I did with the volume and tone pots. I reserve the option to later sink them in if I want to. I measure the position, and after waxing the screws, I manually screw them in. I love this stage as now it starts to very much resemble a guitar. I'm not getting into the actual setup, but I do want the nut to be almost there when I put the strings on. Just a bit more filing to get a better fit. From here, it should be filing the nut and not the neck to get the perfect height. Tuners are the next stop. I position all the pegs and put a piece of masking tape so I can flip it over and attach it from the front. I tighten all the nuts while maintaining the correct orientation for the key part of the peg. After they're all sitting properly, I flip it again and put those little screws in the back. They're there for preventing each peg from rotating in place, and even with mahogany, the challenge is not to overscrew and strip the wood. Again, careful drilling with a manual drill and enough wax should help avoid accidents. Manual screwing, and we're all good. Positioning the bridge requires some accuracy. It needs to be at the correct distance from the nut to match the 25.5 inch or 648 millimeters scale length. It also needs to be centered to both the center line and, more importantly, the neck itself, which is now connected. I check and double check with a straight edge on both sides of the neck and then mark the position of the bridge. I leave just enough room for the bridge pickup. I still have a bit of adjustment room with the bridge saddles themselves, but they can only move so much, so you better be within that range. I want to use the bridge itself as my template for drilling the holes for the strings and for the screws that hold it. It will also be handy for the ferrules in the back. I mark and drill 5 holes for the screws and 6 pilot holes for the strings. Mistakes aside, the screw holes need to match the screws in diameter as well as the depth. As far as the holes for the strings, I only drill the first and last all the way through. After I flip it, I use the 2 holes to align the bridge and mark the row for all 6. Unless using a good drill press, it's sometimes hard to get them aligned, especially when the body is not exactly flat. I mark the position, but also hold the bridge itself in place as I drill with a wider bit which fits the bridge and gives me a straight row of holes to which I fit the ferrules. I gently hammer them in. The strings are going to be pulling them pretty hard anyway, so there's no need to overdo it. Before attaching the bridge, I want to drill and insert a ground wire. I drill from the surface under the bridge diagonally to the pickup cavity and from there to the controls. I'm just going to leave it dangling there and tighten the bridge right over it. I scuff the back of the bridge for better conductivity. I lightly wax and manually tighten all 6 screws. This would also be a good time to reattach the bridge springs and saddles back. We're now getting things ready for the electric part of things. Covering the control cavity with a layer of conductive material should provide protection from extra static noises. Adhesive copper foil is probably the best material for the job, but as I run out of copper, I continue with aluminum, which should be up to the task too. A layer on the cover should seal the whole thing. I may be switching between soldering and soldering, so you can follow along on whichever side of the Atlantic you live. While we get ready for the soldering and the iron to heat up, please take a moment and subscribe, and maybe even hit the little bell to get notified when my next video comes out. I encourage you to comment or ask about anything in the comments below, and I also welcome you to my website, theelectricluthier.com, with dozens of articles on guitar building. I want to do as much soldering as I can away from the body. It's safer and more comfortable. I attached my switch and pots to a piece of MDF in the same position and distance as they'll be in the cavity, and I'll try to do it as neatly as possible. I'm following a wire schematic I took from Seymour and Duncan website. They have a wiring diagram for dozens of combinations. Check it out if you're clueless to wiring as I am. Now, since my humbuckers are not split coiled, this is actually very similar to the standard Telecaster wiring. I start at no particular order and connect the hot output from the switch to the hot terminal of the volume pot. I cover all the fuzzy ends of my vintage wires with shrink-heated isolation and use it also to distinguish it from the black I'll be using for all the ground wires. From the same terminal, I continue to the hot terminal of the tone pot, and I solder them together. At the tone pot, I'll fit a 0.047 resistor from the middle terminal to its own ground at the top of the pot. I cover the longer arm with some yellow shrink so it doesn't short on the side of the pot. The upper arm is cut and soldered to the ground. The third terminal is bent upwards and connected to its own pot ground. I now move to grounding the switch to the volume pot. I'll be connecting all the ground to the volume pot top. It can be done differently, but this way I'm sure I don't accidentally create circular connections in the ground. The tone pot is also grounded by connecting it to the volume pot. The last 2 wires I can attach before moving into the body are the hot and ground wires of the jack socket. The hot one goes from the middle terminal of the volume pot and will receive a red shrink wrap. The black ground will follow and will connect to the top of the volume pot. I'll give them a transparent shrink to hold them together. Before moving to the body, I'm going to try and tidy everything up and heat shrink all the insulation. A heat gun would be useful here, but I'm using a small torch instead, as I don't have one. I try and just caress the connections with a flame without burning anything. This looks so much better at high speed. One more step I see is necessary is also extending the neck pickup wires so they can comfortably reach the controls. I add a black wire to the ground and white wire with green shrink to the hot wire. When I fit the controls into their cavity, I see that the tone pot needs a couple of washers to shim it in a way the shaft doesn't stick out too far on the front side. I'm ready to thread the wires of the neck pickup, but before I thread them, I add an extra black shrink for good measure. I thread it to the bridge pickup cavity. I then combine it with the wiring of the bridge pickup and try and get the bridge grounding wires as well and thread them all together to the control cavity. There is some fiddling and back and forth, but they eventually all fit nicely and come out on the other side. Probably could have used a larger hole here. I secure both pickups. I'm using short stubby screws and I don't even drill a pilot hole. These can very easily strip the threading if over tightened. They're small enough and the wood is soft enough, so I should be fine here. Flipping back to the cavity, I start by masking the area to avoid any soldering mishaps. I now see that the bridge pickup wires can also use a bit of an extension, well, at least the ground wire. I connect the hot bridge pickup wire to the left terminal of the three-way switch and give it some red shrink. I work the ground down and around towards the ground on the top of the volume pot. I now take it and connect to both the neck pickup ground wire and the bridge ground wire. I heat shrink them together and solder them also together to the volume pot. The hot white neck pickup wire, the one I marked in green, now gets soldered to the right terminal of the switch. The jack plug is next. The surrounding ring gets the black ground wire. It is then neatly covered with black shrink and heated to shrink with the tip of the iron. The white hot wire is connected to the other terminal and receives the same shrink treatment, but in red. While I'm here, I also connect the jack socket to its place with the two little screws. I'm going with the grain here, and I skip the pilot holes to firmly but carefully tighten the screws. The soldering part is finished, and I elegantly snap the cover back on. I can feel the magnetic pull. Time to see if all the parts and connections work. I connect the plug to an amp for the tapping test. The neck pickup seems responsive, as does the bridge. The switch differentiates the two and in the right order, and the tone and the volume look to be affecting the sound as they should. Alright, where did I put those strings? I start threading one by one from the back furls through the bridge to the tuners. At the second tuner, I remember that they're actually locking tuners, and I continue accordingly. Locking tuners do make stringing easier, at least on the headstock side. Running all the strings through takes a while, so I'll speed it up here a little. Now that the strings are on, and we have what is often referred to as a guitar. We're at the final stages of the great guitar build-off. I'm done and proud to present this beauty as my entry to this wonderful competition. Jump over to Instagram and give us some love if you want to support this entry. Feel free to comment or ask anything in the comments below. Now, it may seem like I've embellished or tried to hide mistakes while editing the build, and if I had done so, it was just to keep the flow and clarity and not to avoid embarrassing my fragile ego. To prove my point and to give you the benefit of learning from my mistakes, I'll probably have some extra video with all of that. A detailed setup is also in order, and maybe even a demo of how she sounds. If you want to know when that's coming, hit the subscribe button below and don't forget the little bell to get notified. I also welcome you to visit my website, theelectricluthier.com, with much more information on guitar building. But don't just watch and read it, go build a guitar. And that's a wrap.